in the early decades of the 20th century, there was few opportunities in terms of publishing their books, in terms of disseminating ideas, and the politics was still relatively undeveloped. So I feel it might have been a very good decision upon reflection for James to leave. And a lot of people need to realize that even though James left Trinidad, he kept in contact with people from Trinidad.
Yes.
He kept in contact, writing letters, correspondence and things, and he would meet people at conferences too. Right? Remember that Congress at Montreal, Black Writers?
Yes.
He met people from the Caribbean.
Yes.
So we need to understand that even though physically he was no longer in Trinidad and the Caribbean was at the center of James. James wanted federation to be achieved. James wanted Caribbean unity. Even though he realized it had failed, he partly saw the problem as Eric Williams, but this was something he had with a passion.
Interesting. If I may move on to his political sociology, and he's written these books, Modern Politics, Party Politics in the Caribbean, State and Capitalism, which is a political sociology of the Soviet state as a capitalist state, which was an original perspective rather than as a socialist state. And I wonder if we may start with his book on Notes on the Dialectics, the Hegelian book. I am struck by the praise that he gives to Hegel on almost every page. The maestro at his best. The maestro takes it easy here. Hegel is a very wise man. I find that uncomfortable as an African because I know of Hegel's contempt for the African in his theory of history. And I'm wondering whether his love of Hegel perhaps derailed a bit from his historical materialism. As somebody pointed out, maybe he was a left Hegelian rather than a Marxist in the end.
I never thought about that definition of him.
Okay.
Let's take it. But
yes, it's a subtitle of a book some guy wrote about him recently.
Recently?
Yes. 96?
96?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know that. But I'm glad you talked about that because I will sidetrack a bit and come back to something. Now, when I was an undergraduate student here at UWI, I did African history. And I was exposed for the first time, finally undergraduate. I don't know if Sophia ever did the course as history. I was exposed to Dr. Fitzroy Batista the course.
Yes.
And I learned about ancient Africa. I learned about the pyramids and who started off medicine and architecture and engineering and things. Right? And I also learned that a lot of the ideas from the ancient Africans was stolen by the Greeks.
Yes.
Now that is a fact. That is no fiction, and I'm not making that up, right? We have established things, and even in religion, the whole idea of Jesus Christ, you know, about Horus and Isis and things. Now I feel that C.L.R. James, it was unfortunate that as a teenager he wasn't exposed to ancient African civilization, ancient African. Right. As I was saying that I believe that because of his classical education, his European education, which we talked about, his whole political sociology was skewed, was biased. And in fact, a lot of people might have been surprised to see a black man, somebody from the Caribbean, being such a staunch supporter of a so-called white man philosophy and theories. Now when I did ancient Africa history, and I realized these people built the pyramids, and I realized these people had an organization and a society and an economy running. And then I realized that a lot of these invading Greeks and the Romans took back this knowledge. And we no longer hear about the Africans, we hear about Herodotus. We hear about Plato and Socrates, but we don't hear about Imhotep.
No.
Right? We now hear it through Hollywood, through Scorpion King and things about these ancient Africans. But I believe that James started off with an obstacle, a handicap, in that the knowledge that was put into him, you know what is tabula rasa?
Yes.
The knowledge that was poured into this vessel, this big scholar, novelist, politician, was a distorted, a biased European knowledge, that the world revolved around Europe. So he saw the Haitian Revolution beginning and originating as a result of the French Revolution. But I have told people, and this is, I finished already?
No, go ahead.
Oh, no, say 3 minutes. I have told people that one of the faults of James in this political sociology that we are now addressing is that too often he relied on Europe. He used the Europe as the mold to fit Caribbean civilization and to judge African civilization. So a lot of times that is why the left failed in Africa and the Caribbean and was oppressed in the United States. Because people like James, they just took ideas and plop, they dropped it down there in the Caribbean. James should have seen Africa as unique, gone and talked to African intellectuals and decided that I'm going to mold, I'm going to create a new theory. He should have studied ancient African texts more and those writings before he looked at the European writings. And I feel this is why in State Capitalism and World Revolution, and this is why in his work on dialectics, he tended so much, as you rightfully said, to overpraise Hegel. You wonder if he was a relative of Hegel, he was a brother or something, right? And I feel that James should have moved out from that bridled view. He should have realized that there were other theorists out there. Imagine no Latin American theorists he could have used. I wanted to see James do a book on Simon Bolivar rather than a book on world revolution.
Or Hegel.
Or Hegel, right. So I found that, I agree with you, he gave too much profound praise. He exaggerated a lot what Hegel was saying.
Yes.
Now, go ahead.
Yes, I think I see that point, but the motivation for him to read Hegel was from his reading of Lenin, which was his model.
Stepping stone.
Yes, Lenin said you can't understand Marx, first chapter of Capital, without reading and understanding Hegel adequately. And so he took it upon himself as a challenge because many of his comrades did not feel up to the task of reading, talk less of understanding Hegel.
Right.
But he didn't read Hegel as critically as Lenin did. For example, where Hegel is talking about gradualness of the new emerging from the contradiction, Hegel noted leap. To hell with gradualness. Leap, man. You can make a revolution. It doesn't have to always be an evolution of a new idea.
Correct.
But he interpreted that to mean a support for Hegel, whereas Lenin was obviously very critical of Hegel, same way that Marx was very critical of Hegel by saying that Hegel was standing on his head and that we need to put him back on his 2 feet before he can see reality clearly. So if he can be very critical of the Soviet Union, that he was very critical of in state capitalism, if he could be very critical of Trotsky, that he was very critical of in Notes on Dialectics, which was almost completely a critique of Trotskyism. If he could be very critical of Nkrumah and critical of Rodney, these are people closest to him ideologically, and of course I admire that internal criticism. How come he didn't say one word of critique about Hegel? I don't understand that. It doesn't make sense.
I'm glad you brought that up because I have been discussing with a few other scholars and they also brought that to my attention. And what I realized is that James' writings to a large extent was influenced by Hegel. And I will give you an example. You might remember the phrase that Hegel talked about, rational is real and real is rational. And I believe what Hegel is trying to say there, he's saying that you cannot judge a human being in a vacuum. You have to look at the society that molded him. And if you have to look at that society, you're not looking at the society in a vacuum, you look at the historical processes. Now, James used that idea when he was examining the Haitian Revolution and Black Jacobins. He took our leader, Toussaint Louverture, but he didn't look at him just emerging. He looked at his background, he looked at his early childhood, he looked at the people around him, the slave society, and this is how he built up the man. He didn't look at Haiti in isolation, he looked at what was happening in France, in Europe. And so he used the Hegelian way in his works, and he also did that when he was looking at the African states.
The difference, of course, being that he hadn't read Hegel when he wrote
Correct.
the Haitian Revolution.
And that is what is so surprising.
Yes.
That is what is so surprising.
Yes.
And I feel that is why he is so in love with Hegel, because he realized both men are on the same wave. He is on the same wavelength with Hegel. He's understanding what Hegel is saying, right? I don't know if you were going to say something.
Yes, I was going to say that, yes, the critique of Hegel was not that he did not recognize material existence as well as ideas. From the point of view of Marx, why he said he was standing on his head was because he gave primacy to ideas.
Yes.
And this is what C.L.R. is defending all the way through. And then he went off into a picong by saying that whether you're going to argue with him, if you want to argue with him whether Hegel is right or wrong in giving primacy to the idea, that you're just going to play with yourself. That he's not going to even debate with you around that. But I find it perhaps consistent with the choices that C.L.R. has made, from joining the light Tuscan team, cricket team, from defending America and praising Athens, from almost all that he did. Hegel would have been a good companion to him, and even his conception of leadership as the man of idea who can debate with anybody and win a debate without, well, I don't know. I found out perhaps it was Hegel that, or the influence of Hegel, that introduced almost all the distortions in his ideas.
In James' ideas.
In James's idea. How can he, for example, conceptualize the role of the working class as fighting against Soviet Russia during the Cold War? That the Stalinist party, with all its faults, perhaps needed to be fought by the working class, but I still do not see the Stalinist state as the primary enemy of the working class movement at that time. And to the credit of James, he prophesied that Stalinist party was going to be smashed by the workers, organizing spontaneously as if he knew what was going to happen in 89 and 90 just before he died. This thing happened. But his prediction that the smashed party will now be replaced by a socialist organization by the workers did not materialize, because bourgeois parties stepped into the void and started rebuilding a bourgeois revolution rather than a socialist one. And I think the idealism of Hegel is to blame for a lot of those, well, I shall call them excesses in his political sociology. But I don't know what you think, especially reflecting on party politics in the Caribbean modern politics. What would you say is James's most original contribution to political sociology?
I feel his most original contribution is that it is the first time that the Caribbean society is being compared with Europe. Not just the Black Jacobins, that's the beginning, but throughout his life, he keeps on looking at the Caribbean through European tinted lenses. And I feel that is his major thing, that before we always saw the Caribbean as being limited, as being under colonialism, and after colonialism, self-government. We always saw it be the French colonies, the Dutch-speaking colonies. We always saw it as being tied to Europe in that way, a colonial sense, ownership. But here James is presenting something where he is using European theories, he's using European events to try to change the Caribbean society. All the time we always saw the mother colonies, the mother countries, just exploiting the colonies. That was a one-way relationship. James is now forcing ideas back to the Caribbean and back to Africa. But I feel that one of the reasons that James likes Hegel so much is the way that Hegel looks at the whole idea of the absolute. The way that he's able, when Hegel develops the idea about if you want to examine the society properly, you have to look at all the various elements. You have to look at art, religion, history, and that sort of thing. And I think this is what James comes out in his writings like Beyond the Boundary. That Hegelian approach, where he's not looking at it in a small way. And this is what is not appreciated by a lot of these early African leaders. They tended to look at their history as limited. But James, like in the Hegelian fashion, was looking at it to see what influenced it before. Looking at it as the fragments that would have influenced it before, and to create a complete whole. So James was trying to put together a philosophical and political puzzle, trying to fill in the pieces in Caribbean history and in the African history, and a lot of the early leaders didn't see that. And this, I feel, was one of the reasons that he was able to draw so much on the early European people, particularly the Hegel. But what I feel James, he didn't develop too much in state capitalism and world revolution, was this whole idea of freedom. Remember Hegel talked about rationality and he sort of equated with freedom. I felt James should have realized, he should have sort of set boundaries to freedom. He should have defined freedom more. Also, James didn't talk about this world revolution ending. To me, when I read the book for the first time, I got the impression that this revolution was something ongoing. It was something that we would never say, well, the revolution has ended, it is time to live like normal people, right? He gives the idea that we will always be struggling, we will always be building, we'll always be organizing. But I feel this might be one of the flaws in the book, right? That he gives the idea that it's an ongoing revolution. And because he uses the left jargon, the bourgeois, the proletariat and thing, a lot of the readers find it difficult to understand where would this revolution begin and when will it end?
Yes, which is a debate between Stalinism on one hand
and Trotskyism.
To a small
extent,
at that time he was still a Trotskyist, but after he read Hegel, he distanced himself more from Trotsky. But let me close by asking you about your own work on James.
Right.
Do you want to tell us more about the things you have written or studied about James?
Okay.
Yeah.
I have given 2 conference papers at UWI here a few years ago whilst I was a postgrad. One of those papers dealt with C.L.R. James and the labor movement, where I looked at his links abroad and with the OWTU. And then at a next small seminar right here at UWI, I looked at the issue of Pan-Africanism. And what I tried to develop in those papers is that we are seeing a philosopher, somebody who is considered abstract, dealing with ideas, who is a staunch Pan-Africanist. He has Africa at heart, he has produced the Black Jacobins, but yet he's able to mix class with this. He is from the left.
Yes.
And this, I feel, is unique. And a lot of people have tended to avoid looking at James as a left and also as a Pan-Africanist, somebody from the left, a Pan-Africanist, because often people tended to see a dichotomy between the two. So I find it was very amazing, very brilliant of James to combine his left-leaning, his ideas of Marx and Stalinism and Trotskyism with something that dealt with Pan-Africanism, race consciousness. Remember, he was influenced by Garveyism, he was influenced by Henry Sylvester Williams, W.E.B. Du Bois, Padmore. Yes. All these people helped influence and shape James to make him more conscious of the blacks, the problems of the blacks. So I found this was a dilemma and a lot of people didn't look at and a lot of people didn't address. If they're looking at James, they looked at his ideological aspect. If they're looking at James, they looked at his work on a Pan-African revolt. But they never wondered, was he more leftist than Pan-Africanist? Was he more Pan-Africanist than communist or socialist? So I feel this is a problem that will continue to plague scholars and a lot of people to really decide where did James really lie? Was he really convinced that a class-based society was important, or did he really have priority a Pan-Africanist? You know? But what I have found out was he was somebody who was able to balance the two. He was able, and a lot of people fail to realize and understand that. It is somebody who could be a politician and also be a lawyer. He could have his practice in the evening. A teacher who could also be a husband or a wife in the evening when that person leaves the job. So this is what James was seeing his life. His life, he was able to balance it, and he never saw as having a conflicting interest.
No.
He never saw it, and funny enough, nobody ever accused him of saying, but you're a black nationalist, why are you preaching about the working class? In a lot of his works, like Negro Americans Take the Lead, he always tried to balance that, talking about the working class, but the black working class. You know, so I feel this is what my approach has been, to show people that James has, to a large extent, been able to not just be a normal little politician, not just write a novel, not just make a contribution in terms of a good orator, but he has been able to create an individual who has a double consciousness. You will know that term from sociology.
Yes, from Du Bois.
Yes, a double consciousness where he's a Pan-Africanist and he's also from the left.